I never imagined that handing over the keys to my family home would lead to me sleeping on a concrete floor in a garage that reeked of motor oil and desperation. But there I was, 72 years old, wrapped in a thin blanket that barely covered my aching joints, listening to my son Marcus and his wife Vanessa laughing through the walls of what used to be my sanctuary. The house where I'd raised 3 children, where I'd celebrated 47 wedding anniversaries with my late husband Robert, where I'd planned to live out my golden years in dignity. Instead, I was treated like an unwelcome guest in my own former home, relegated to sleeping between lawnmowers and paint cans like some forgotten piece of furniture they couldn't quite throw away. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The turning point came on a Tuesday morning when I heard Vanessa on the phone with her sister, her voice carrying through the thin garage door as she stood in what used to be my kitchen. She was complaining about having to deal with me, calling me a burden they couldn't shake, describing how she'd convinced Marcus to move me out to the garage because she was tired of pretending to care about the old woman who gave them everything. That's when I knew I had to make the call that would change all of our lives forever. My name is Mildred Foster, though everyone who's ever mattered to me has called me Millie. At 72, I've lived through more seasons of joy and heartbreak than most people could imagine. But nothing prepared me for the cruel lesson I was about to learn about family loyalty and the price of unconditional love. For 47 years, I shared my life with Robert Foster, a man who built our dreams with his own 2 hands and taught our children that family meant everything. Together, we created a life in the sprawling 2-story colonial on Maple Street that became the heart of our universe, a place where Sunday dinners lasted for hours, and grandchildren learned to ride bicycles on the wraparound porch that Robert had insisted on adding during our 3rd year there. Robert wasn't the kind of man who spoke in flowery words or grand gestures, but he showed his love through action. He built the breakfast nook, where I spent countless mornings watching our children grow up over bowls of oatmeal and glasses of orange juice. He installed the window seat in the living room where I'd curl up with books on rainy afternoons, and he planted the rose garden that bloomed every spring like a testament to his devotion. When the children were small, he'd wake up before dawn to shovel snow from the driveway so I wouldn't have to worry about getting to my job at the elementary school, where I taught 2nd grade for 32 years. He was the kind of husband who remembered that I liked my coffee with just a splash of cream, and who never went to bed without telling me he loved me, even during the arguments that married couples inevitably have. Our children grew up in that house with a sense of security that Robert and I had never known in our own childhoods. Marcus, our eldest, was always the responsible one, the boy who helped his father with yard work and took pride in learning to fix things around the house. He brought home good grades and never gave us a moment's real trouble, always respectful and eager to please. Our daughter Sarah was our free spirit, the one who filled the house with music and laughter, who could convince her father to let her paint her bedroom walls any color she wanted just by batting her eyelashes. And then there was Tommy, our youngest, who kept us all on our toes with his endless energy and creative schemes that usually ended with muddy footprints tracked through my clean kitchen. The house on Maple Street wasn't just where we lived, it was where we learned to be a family. It was where Robert taught Marcus to throw a baseball in the backyard, where Sarah practiced piano recitals in the living room until the neighbors knew her pieces by heart, where Tommy built elaborate blanket forts that took over the entire den for weeks at a time. Every room held memories that seemed to seep into the very walls, creating an atmosphere of warmth and belonging that made everyone who visited feel like they were part of something special. Robert used to say that houses don't make homes, people do, but our house on Maple Street felt like it had been blessed with an extra measure of love that made everything inside it matter more. When Robert started showing signs of the illness that would eventually take him from us, we both knew our time in that house together was becoming precious in ways we'd never fully appreciated before. He'd been experiencing shortness of breath for months, dismissing it as getting older or being out of shape, but when he finally collapsed in the garden while tending to his beloved roses, we couldn't ignore the truth any longer. The diagnosis of congestive heart failure hit us like a physical blow, stealing the breath from both of our lungs as we sat in the doctor's office holding hands and trying to process what it meant for our future together. Robert's decline was gradual at first, giving us time to adjust to the new reality of oxygen tanks and medication schedules, of doctor's appointments that dominated our calendar, and quiet evenings spent talking about things we'd always assumed we'd have more time to discuss. He was determined to spend his remaining time at home, in the house where we'd built our life together, and I was equally determined to make sure he had everything he needed to be comfortable and surrounded by love. We converted the den into a bedroom so he wouldn't have to manage the stairs, and I learned to operate medical equipment that I'd never imagined would become part of our daily routine. During those final months, the house seemed to wrap itself around us like a protective embrace, offering comfort and familiarity when everything else felt uncertain and frightening. Robert would sit by the window in the den, watching the seasons change in the garden he'd cultivated for decades, pointing out which roses were blooming, and making plans for improvements he knew he'd never live to see. We'd have breakfast together at the kitchen table, where we'd shared thousands of meals, and he'd tell me stories about our early years that I'd heard before but cherished hearing again. In the evenings, I'd read to him from books we'd collected over the years, our voices mixing with the familiar sounds of the house settling around us like an old friend getting comfortable for the night. When Robert passed away on a crisp October morning, slipping away peacefully in his sleep while I held his hand, I felt like part of the house died with him. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, a deep quiet that seemed to echo through rooms that had been filled with his presence for so many years. The children came for the funeral, of course, gathering in the living room where we'd celebrated so many holidays and milestones. But even surrounded by family, I felt profoundly alone in a way that scared me more than I wanted to admit. After the funeral, when the last casserole had been eaten and the final sympathy card had been read, I found myself rattling around in a house that suddenly felt too big and too empty for one person. Every room held reminders of Robert, from the coffee mug he'd used every morning to the reading glasses he'd left on his nightstand, and while those reminders brought comfort, they also emphasized how drastically my life had changed. I'd gone from being half of a partnership that had lasted nearly 5 decades to being completely on my own for the first time since I was in my early 20s. The practical aspects of widowhood were overwhelming in ways I hadn't anticipated. Robert had always handled the finances, the insurance, the maintenance issues that inevitably arose in a house that was over 50 years old. Suddenly, I was fielding calls from contractors about a leaky roof, trying to understand investment statements that might as well have been written in a foreign language. And
preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Making decisions about everything from lawn care to heating bills on a fixed income that seemed to shrink a little more each month. The house that had been our sanctuary began to feel like a burden I wasn't sure I could carry alone. Marcus started visiting more frequently after his father's death, initially offering help with practical matters and emotional support during the hardest days of my grief. He'd come by on weekends to check on things around the house, fixing minor problems and making sure I was eating properly and taking care of myself. Those visits were a lifeline during the darkest period of my mourning, giving me something to look forward to and reminding me that I wasn't completely alone in the world. He'd bring Vanessa sometimes, and she seemed pleasant enough, asking about my health and commenting on how well I was managing such a big house by myself. It was during one of these visits, about 6 months after Robert's death, that Marcus first broached the subject of me signing the house over to him. He approached it delicately, framing it as a way to help me avoid future complications with estate planning and taxes, explaining that it would be easier for everyone if the transfer happened while I was still healthy and able to make my own decisions. He assured me that nothing would change, that I could continue living there for as long as I wanted, but that having his name on the deed would simplify things down the road and give me peace of mind about what would happen to the family home. The idea made sense on the surface, and Marcus presented it with such genuine concern for my well-being that I found myself seriously considering it. He'd always been the responsible one, the child who'd never given us any reason to doubt his judgment or his commitment to family. He spoke about wanting to preserve the house where he'd grown up, about making sure it stayed in the family, and continued to be a place where future generations could gather and make memories. He painted a picture of holiday celebrations and grandchildren playing in the same rooms where he and his siblings had grown up, and I found myself getting emotional thinking about the continuity and legacy that the house represented. Vanessa was supportive of the idea as well, talking about how much she loved the house, and how honored she'd be to help take care of it. She spoke about the potential improvements they could make, updating the kitchen and bathrooms while preserving the character and charm that made the house so special. She seemed to understand the emotional significance of the place, commenting on specific details like the built-in bookshelves in the library and the hardwood floors that Robert had refinished himself during our second year there. Her enthusiasm felt genuine, and I appreciated that she seemed to recognize what the house meant to our family. The decision wasn't one I made lightly or quickly. I spent weeks thinking about it, weighing the practical benefits against my own emotional attachment to maintaining ownership of the place where I'd built my entire adult life. I consulted with Sarah and Tommy, both of whom supported Marcus's suggestion, and agreed that it made sense from a financial and legal perspective. Sarah lived across the country with her own family and admitted that she wouldn't be able to help much with the practical aspects of maintaining the property. Tommy was dealing with his own financial struggles and felt that Marcus was in the best position to take responsibility for the house. Eventually, I convinced myself that signing over the deed was the right thing to do for everyone involved. Marcus had a stable job, a good marriage, and the financial resources to properly maintain the property. He'd grown up in the house and understood its significance to our family history. Most importantly, he'd promised that nothing would change for me, that I could continue living there for as long as I wanted, and that my comfort and well-being would always be his top priority. With those assurances, I finally agreed to transfer ownership of the house to Marcus, believing that I was making a smart decision that would benefit everyone while ensuring that the family home would remain in loving hands. The day we went to the lawyer's office to sign the paperwork was bittersweet for me. As I put my signature on the documents that officially transferred ownership of my home to my son, I felt a mix of relief and loss that was difficult to reconcile. Part of me was grateful to no longer have the full weight of responsibility for such a large property, while another part of me mourned the symbolic end of an era that had defined my identity for so many years. Marcus was gracious and emotional during the signing, thanking me repeatedly for trusting him with something so precious and promising that he would honor the legacy that Robert and I had created there. For the first few months after the transfer, everything proceeded exactly as Marcus had promised. I continued living in the house as I always had, maintaining my routines and feeling secure in my familiar surroundings. Marcus and Vanessa would visit regularly, bringing groceries or helping with small tasks around the house, and their presence felt supportive rather than intrusive. Vanessa seemed particularly interested in learning about the history of different rooms, asking me to tell her stories about holidays we'd celebrated there and milestones we'd marked within those walls. I found myself enjoying these conversations, feeling like I was passing down important family history to someone who would appreciate and preserve it. But slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, things began to change in ways that made me question whether I'd made the right decision. It started with small suggestions about modifications to the house that would make it more efficient or modern. Vanessa began commenting on how outdated some of the fixtures were, how much money could be saved on heating bills if we upgraded the windows, how much more functional the kitchen could be with some strategic renovations. These observations were always presented as helpful suggestions rather than criticism, but they began to make me feel like I was living in a house that no longer quite belonged to me. Marcus started making decisions about maintenance and repairs without consulting me first, hiring contractors to work on projects that I hadn't requested and wasn't sure were necessary. When I questioned these choices, he reminded me gently that he was now responsible for the upkeep of the property, and that he was just trying to protect his investment while making sure I was comfortable and safe. His explanations were always reasonable, but they left me feeling like I was gradually losing control over my own living environment. The most disturbing change was in how Vanessa began to treat me during their visits. The warm interest she'd shown in family stories and house history was replaced by a more critical assessment of how I was managing my daily life. She'd comment on dishes in the sink, suggest that I was having trouble keeping up with housework, and make observations about my memory or physical capabilities that felt more like evaluations than conversations. When I'd push back or assert that I was managing just fine, she'd smile and agree, but in a way that felt patronizing rather than reassuring. Looking back, I can see that this was the beginning of a systematic campaign to make me feel incompetent and dependent, to create justification for the much more dramatic changes that were coming. At the time, though, I was still grieving Robert's death, still adjusting to living alone, and still trying to maintain my independence in a house that was becoming less familiar and welcoming with each passing week. I told myself that Marcus and Vanessa were just trying to help, that their suggestions came from a place of love and concern, and that I needed to be more open to accepting assistance as I aged. It wasn't until they announced their plan to move into the house permanently that I began to understand how completely my life was about to change, and how little say I would have in determining what that change would look like. The announcement came on a rainy Thursday evening in March, almost exactly 1 year after I had signed over the deed to my beloved home. Marcus and Vanessa had arrived for what I assumed would be our usual weekly dinner, but instead of the casual conversation and updates about their lives that typically filled these visits, they sat across from me at the kitchen table with matching serious expressions that immediately put me on edge. Marcus cleared his throat in the way he'd done since childhood when he had something important to say, and Vanessa reached over to place her hand on mine with a gesture that felt more calculated than comforting. They'd been doing a lot of thinking, Marcus explained, about my living situation and their own future plans. Vanessa was pregnant, they announced, due in the fall, and they felt it was time to seriously consider what kind of environment would be best for raising their child. The apartment they'd been renting across town was too small for a growing family, and with property values continuing to rise, it made financial sense for them to move into the house permanently, rather than continue paying rent elsewhere, while also maintaining a property they now owned. I should have been overjoyed about the pregnancy news, and part of me genuinely was excited about the prospect of having a grandchild to spoil and love. But the way they presented this information, coupled with their obvious expectations about how it would change our current arrangement, filled me with a dread that I tried desperately to hide behind congratulatory smiles and appropriate enthusiasm. Marcus continued explaining their reasoning with the same logical, measured tone he'd used when convincing me to sign over the deed, laying out practical considerations about childcare, mortgage payments, and the benefits of multi-generational living that sounded perfectly reasonable on the surface. Vanessa picked up where Marcus left off, describing how wonderful it would be for their child to grow up in the same house where Marcus had been raised, to benefit from having a grandmother nearby to provide wisdom and assistance with childcare. She painted a picture of cozy family dinners and shared responsibilities that made me feel like I should be grateful for the opportunity to be so closely involved in my grandchild's life. She spoke about how much help I could provide with babysitting and household tasks, framing my potential contributions as valuable assets rather than burdens. But something about her tone made these suggestions feel more like expectations than invitations. The transition happened gradually over the next few months, with Marcus and Vanessa moving their belongings into the house bit by bit while maintaining the fiction that we were all excited about this new arrangement. They started by claiming the master bedroom, the room where Robert and I had slept for decades, explaining that they needed more space, and that the smaller guest room where I'd been sleeping since Robert's death was perfectly adequate for my needs. I watched them hang their wedding photos where mine had been displayed, replace Robert's favorite reading chair with furniture from their apartment, and slowly but systematically erase the visual reminders of the life I'd built in that house. The changes weren't just cosmetic. Vanessa had strong opinions about everything, from the temperature settings on the thermostat to the brands of cleaning products that should be used throughout the house. She instituted new rules about noise levels in the evenings, explaining that she needed to maintain a regular sleep schedule for the health of the baby. She rearranged the kitchen to accommodate her preferred cooking methods and storage systems, relegating my familiar dishes and utensils to harder-to-reach cabinets while giving prime real estate to her own belongings. What disturbed me most was how these changes were always presented as improvements or necessities, rather than preferences. When I expressed discomfort with the new arrangements, Marcus would remind me that the house needed to work for everyone who lived there, and that compromise was essential for successful multi-generational living. Vanessa would agree enthusiastically, often adding comments about how set in my ways I'd become, and how important it was for me to stay flexible and open to new ideas as I aged. The pregnancy gave them additional leverage in these negotiations, with every request framed in terms of what would be best for the baby's health and development. When I complained about the noise from their late-night television watching, Vanessa explained that pregnancy insomnia made it difficult for her to maintain a normal sleep schedule, and that I needed to be more understanding of her condition. When I objected to the strong-smelling cleaning products she preferred, she cited pregnancy-related sensitivities that required specific brands and formulations that happened to trigger my own allergies and respiratory issues. By the time their daughter Emma was born in October, I felt like a guest in my own former home, relegated to spaces and times that didn't interfere with the primary residents' comfort and routines. The baby's arrival only intensified this feeling, as every room in the house was suddenly reorganized around the needs of an infant whose cries dominated the soundscape from morning until night. Vanessa had very specific ideas about childcare and household management that left little room for my input or experience, despite her earlier promises about valuing my wisdom and assistance. I offered to help with night feedings and diaper changes, drawing on decades of experience raising my own 3 children. But Vanessa politely declined most of my suggestions, explaining that she'd read extensively about modern parenting techniques and preferred to follow current expert recommendations rather than outdated methods from previous generations. When I did manage to spend time with Emma, Vanessa would hover nearby, ready to intervene if I didn't handle the baby exactly according to her specifications. The isolation I felt was compounded by the gradual loss of my own social connections and independence. Marcus and Vanessa had installed new locks on all the exterior doors, ostensibly for security purposes, but the practical effect was that I needed to ask permission to come and go from the house where I'd lived freely for decades. They explained that they needed to know when people were entering and leaving for safety reasons, especially with a newborn in the house, but requesting access to step onto my own front porch felt humiliating and infantilizing. My weekly bridge game with longtime friends became increasingly difficult to maintain, as Vanessa would schedule household activities or baby-related tasks during the times when I'd planned to be out. When I protested that these commitments were important for my mental health and social well-being, she'd expressed surprise that I hadn't mentioned my plans earlier, suggesting that better communication would prevent these scheduling conflicts in the future. But somehow, no matter how far in advance I mentioned my intentions, there always seemed to be urgent reasons why I was needed at home instead. The financial aspects of our arrangement were equally problematic, though they were discussed so rarely and in such vague terms that it took me months to understand how completely I'd been cut out of decisions about expenses and budgeting. Marcus had taken over all the household accounts after moving in, explaining that it would be more efficient to consolidate everything under his management, since he was now responsible for the mortgage, utilities, and maintenance costs. I continued to contribute my Social Security payments toward household expenses, but I had no visibility into how that money was being spent or whether it was adequate to cover my fair share of the costs. When I asked to see financial statements or participate in discussions about major purchases and renovations, Marcus would patiently explain that these details were too complicated and stressful for me to worry about, that his priority was protecting me from the burdens of financial management so I could focus on enjoying my retirement. But retirement felt less like freedom and more like irrelevance when every aspect of my daily life was determined by other people's decisions about budgets and priorities I wasn't allowed to influence. The holidays that first year were particularly painful, as traditions that had been maintained for decades were suddenly abandoned in favor of new approaches that better suited Marcus and Vanessa's preferences. Thanksgiving dinner was moved from the formal dining room to the kitchen island, because it was more convenient for managing Emma's schedule. Christmas morning was restructured around the baby's nap times rather than the leisurely gift-opening sessions that had been a family tradition since my children were small. When I suggested maintaining some of our long-time customs, Vanessa would smile sympathetically and explain that they needed to create new traditions that worked for their immediate family unit. The guest list for holiday celebrations changed as well, with Vanessa's family taking priority over longtime family friends and more distant relatives who had been part of our gatherings for years. When I asked about inviting people who'd been coming to our house for holiday meals since before Marcus was born, Vanessa would express concern about having too many people around the baby, or worry about the additional work involved in hosting larger groups. Gradually, our holiday celebrations shrank to include only Marcus, Vanessa, Emma, and me, with occasional appearances by Vanessa's parents and siblings who lived closer to town. The spring following Emma's birth brought a new round of changes disguised as home improvements and renovations that would make the house more functional for a growing family. Marcus hired contractors to convert Robert's former workshop in the basement into a playroom for Emma, clearing out decades' worth of tools and projects that represented his father's hobbies and interests. When I objected to disposing of items that held sentimental value, Marcus assured me that he'd keep anything truly important, but most of Robert's belongings ended up donated or discarded without my input. The rose garden that Robert had cultivated so lovingly was replaced with a swing set and sandbox that would be more appropriate for a young child's entertainment. Vanessa explained that maintaining flowers required too much time and effort that could be better spent on family activities, and that the thorns on the rose bushes presented safety hazards once Emma became mobile. I watched through the kitchen window as workers pulled up plants that Robert had nurtured for decades, replacing them with playground equipment that seemed to mock the memory of quiet evenings we'd spent together admiring his handiwork. My own belongings were gradually relocated to smaller and less convenient spaces throughout the house, always with explanations about maximizing storage efficiency or accommodating Emma's growing collection of toys and baby equipment. The china cabinet that had displayed my mother's dishes for 30 years was moved to the basement to make room for a changing station in the dining room. Photo albums documenting decades of family history were boxed up and stored in the attic because they took up too much space in the living areas that needed to remain child-safe and clutter-free. Each individual change seemed reasonable when viewed in isolation, but the cumulative effect was to systematically erase evidence of my presence and history in the house where I'd spent most of my adult life. I felt like I was watching my own life being edited out of existence, replaced by a version of family history that positioned me as a peripheral figure rather than the woman who'd built this home through decades of love, sacrifice, and daily attention to the details that make a house feel like a sanctuary. The most painful part of this process was how thoroughly Marcus had been convinced that these changes were not only necessary, but beneficial for everyone involved. When I tried to express my feelings about losing so many reminders of my life with Robert, he'd remind me that holding on to the past wasn't healthy, and that I needed to focus on building new memories with Emma and their growing family. He seemed genuinely puzzled by my resistance to modifications that he saw as obvious improvements, and his confusion made me question whether I was being unreasonable or overly sentimental about objects and arrangements that didn't really matter in the long run. Vanessa was less diplomatic in her approach to these conversations, often suggesting that my attachment to old furniture and outdated decorating schemes was preventing the house from reaching its full potential as a comfortable home for a young family. She'd point out how much brighter and more spacious rooms looked after they'd been updated with her preferred color schemes and furniture arrangements. She'd make comments about how much easier it was to keep things clean and organized when there wasn't so much accumulated clutter from previous decades weighing everything down. The social dynamics within the house became increasingly uncomfortable as well, particularly when Vanessa's friends and family members came to visit. I'd find myself excluded from conversations that took place in common areas, not through any explicit rejection, but through the subtle signals that indicated my presence wasn't particularly welcome or valued. Topics of discussion centered around parenting strategies, career developments, and social activities that didn't include anyone from my generation, leaving me feeling like an obsolete relic who'd outlived her usefulness. When I tried to contribute to these conversations by sharing relevant experiences from my own parenting years, or offering perspectives based on my longer life experience, my comments would be politely acknowledged and then quickly dismissed as the discussion moved on to more current concerns. Vanessa would sometimes make comments about how different things were now compared to how they used to be, suggesting that my experiences weren't particularly relevant to modern challenges and opportunities. The baby's first birthday party in October illustrated how completely my role in family celebrations had been diminished. Despite taking place in the house where I lived, the party was planned and executed entirely according to Vanessa's vision, with decorations, menu, and guest list that reflected her preferences rather than any input from me. I was assigned the role of helpful grandmother, responsible for tasks like washing dishes and clearing tables, while the real celebration happened around me without my meaningful participation. When longtime family friends asked about attending the party, Vanessa explained that they were keeping it small and intimate, focused on people who were actively involved in Emma's daily life. The guest list included Vanessa's college friends, neighbors who'd become close to the couple since they'd moved into the house, and Vanessa's extended family, but it excluded people who'd been part of Marcus's life since childhood, but hadn't maintained regular contact with him as an adult. I spent most of the party in the kitchen, preparing food and cleaning up while watching through the window as guests enjoyed themselves in the backyard where Robert's rose garden used to bloom. The laughter and conversation that filled the house should have brought me joy, but instead, it emphasized how little connection I felt to the celebration of my own granddaughter's milestone in my own former home. By winter, the pattern of marginalization had become so established that I rarely bothered to express preferences or opinions about household decisions, knowing that they'd be politely noted and then completely ignored in favor of whatever Marcus and Vanessa had already decided. I felt like I was living in a performance of family harmony, where my role was to provide the appearance of multi-generational cooperation while having no actual influence over any aspect of my daily experience. The breaking point came in February, almost 2 years after I'd signed over the deed to the house and nearly 18 months after Marcus and Vanessa had moved in permanently. Vanessa was pregnant again, due in early summer, and the prospect of a second child prompted discussions about space allocation and household organization that would fundamentally alter what little comfort and independence I had left. The conversation took place over dinner on a Sunday evening, with Emma playing quietly in her high chair while Marcus and Vanessa outlined their vision for accommodating a larger family within the existing house structure. They'd been consulting with contractors and interior designers, they explained, about the most efficient ways to maximize the available space and create appropriate environments for 2 young children to grow and thrive. The guest room where I'd been sleeping since they'd claimed the master bedroom would need to be converted into a nursery for the new baby, they announced. Emma would eventually transition to a larger bedroom, but for the first year or two, it would make the most sense to have the infant closer to their own room for convenience during night feedings and diaper changes. They'd researched options for my sleeping arrangements, they assured me, and had identified several possibilities that would work well for everyone involved. The basement had a finished area that could be converted into a comfortable bedroom suite with its own bathroom and separate entrance, giving me more privacy and independence while freeing up the main floor for family activities. Another option was the converted attic space, which would require some renovation but could be made quite cozy and would provide even more separation between my living area and the spaces where the children would be playing and sleeping. As they described these alternatives, I felt my world shrinking even further, my presence in the house being pushed literally to the margins while the central areas were reserved for the family members who really mattered. The basement felt like exile to a dungeon, while the attic seemed like banishment to a servant's quarters, both options designed to minimize my visibility and impact on the daily life of the household that had once revolved around my own needs and preferences. But the worst was yet to come. After outlining these options and giving me time to process the information, Marcus gently suggested that there was another possibility we should consider, one that might actually be better for everyone in the long run. Perhaps it was time to think about whether living together was really working out as well as they'd hoped when they'd first moved in. Maybe I'd be happier and more independent in a smaller place of my own, somewhere I could have complete control over my environment and wouldn't have to adjust to the noise and chaos that inevitably came with raising young children. Vanessa nodded enthusiastically as Marcus spoke, adding that she'd been researching senior living communities in the area and had found several that offered excellent amenities and social opportunities for people in my age group. These places were specifically designed for older adults, she explained, with activities and services that would keep me engaged and healthy in ways that might be difficult to achieve while living in a house full of young people with completely different schedules and interests. They presented this suggestion as a generous offer to help me transition to a more appropriate living situation, emphasizing the independence and freedom I'd gain by not having to accommodate the needs of a growing family. Marcus offered to help with the financial aspects of the transition, to assist with finding a suitable apartment or senior community, and to ensure that I had everything I needed to be comfortable in a new environment. But I understood what was really happening. They wanted me gone. After taking ownership of my house, after systematically erasing my presence and preferences from every room and routine, after reducing my role in family life to that of an unpaid babysitter and housekeeper, they were ready to complete the process by removing me entirely from the property that had been my home for over 4 decades. The realization hit me with such force that I felt physically dizzy, as if the chair beneath me had suddenly become unstable. I excused myself from the table, claiming fatigue, and retreated to the guest room that would soon be taken away from me as well. I sat on the edge of the bed where I'd spent so many sleepless nights since Robert's death, trying to process how completely I'd been manipulated and betrayed by the son I'd trusted with everything I had to give. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and thinking about the series of decisions that had led me to this moment of complete powerlessness. I thought about Robert and how disappointed he'd be to see what had happened to the woman he'd loved and protected for so many years. I thought about the house itself, about all the dreams and hopes we'd invested in those walls, and how thoroughly that legacy had been corrupted by people who saw it only as real estate to be optimized for their own convenience. But mostly, I thought about the fact that I still had choices to make, even if they weren't the choices I'd ever imagined I'd face at this stage of my life. I could accept their plan and allow myself to be transferred to some institutional setting where I'd live out my remaining years as a displaced person with no real connection to the life I'd built. Or I could find a way to fight back, to reclaim some measure of dignity and control over my own existence. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. I wasn't going to go quietly into whatever exile they had planned for me. I was going to make them understand exactly what they'd done and what it was going to cost them. The first step was to clearly understand my legal position and what options might be available to someone in my situation. I'd given away my house, but I hadn't given away my rights or my ability to make decisions about my own life. I needed to educate myself about what those rights were and how I might be able to exercise them. I spent the next few days making discreet phone calls and doing research online, learning about issues like elder abuse, financial exploitation, and the legal protections available to older adults who found themselves in vulnerable situations. What I discovered both encouraged and horrified me. There were laws designed to protect people like me from exactly the kind of treatment I'd been experiencing. But enforcing those protections required a level of documentation and advocacy that seemed overwhelming for someone in my position. More importantly, I realized that my situation wasn't nearly as hopeless as Marcus and Vanessa wanted me to believe. The house might be in Marcus's name, but there were still legal remedies available to people who'd been coerced or deceived into transferring property under false pretenses. The key was proving that I'd been promised things that hadn't been delivered, and that the transfer had been based on misrepresentations about what my life would look like after giving up ownership. As I gathered information and began to formulate a plan, I started paying closer attention to the daily dynamics in the house, documenting the ways I was being treated and the systematic erosion of my comfort and dignity. I began keeping a journal, recording conversations and incidents that illustrated the gap between what I'd been promised and what I was actually experiencing. The most damaging evidence came from Vanessa herself, during phone conversations with her friends and family members that she conducted without seeming to care whether I could overhear her from adjacent rooms. She would complain about having to deal with me, describe me as a burden they couldn't wait to get rid of, and make jokes about old people who didn't know when it was time to get out of the way. It was during one of these conversations, on a Tuesday morning in early March, that I heard her describe their plan to move me to the garage as a temporary solution until they could convince me to move out entirely. She was talking to her sister, explaining that the second baby was due in just a few months, and that they needed to free up the guest room immediately. The garage had been converted into a basic living space, she said, with electricity and running water, and it would give them time to find a more permanent solution for the old woman who didn't seem to understand that she wasn't wanted anymore. That was the moment I knew I needed to make the call that would change everything. Not to a lawyer or a social service agency, though those conversations would come later. The first call I needed to make was to my daughter Sarah, the one person in my family who I believed would still see me as a mother deserving of love and respect, rather than a problem to be managed and eventually discarded. But before I made that call, I needed to be sure I was ready for the consequences of whatever came next. Because once I asked for help, there would be no pretending anymore that this was a temporary misunderstanding or a series of unfortunate miscommunications. Once I admitted that my own son had betrayed me so completely, I'd have to face the reality that the family I'd devoted my life to building had fundamentally failed in the most basic obligation that children have to their parents. The thought terrified me, but it also filled me with the determination I hadn't felt since Robert's death. I was 72 years old, but I wasn't dead yet, and I wasn't going to let them bury me alive in a garage behind the house where I'd once been the queen of my own domain. The transition to the garage happened on a cold morning in late March, barely a week after Vanessa's phone conversation with her sister that had revealed their true intentions. Marcus knocked on my bedroom door just after 7, his face carefully arranged in an expression of apologetic determination as he explained that the contractors would be arriving within the hour to begin converting the guest room into a nursery. The urgency was unexpected, he claimed, but Vanessa's doctor had recommended setting up the baby's space earlier than originally planned due to some concerns about her pregnancy that required immediate bed rest and reduced stress. I stood there in my nightgown and robe, listening to him explain how they'd worked through the night to make the garage space comfortable and livable for me, installing a space heater and bringing down some basic furniture so I wouldn't have to sleep on the concrete floor. It was only temporary, he assured me, just until they could finalize arrangements for a more permanent living situation that would give me the independence and freedom I deserved. His words were gentle and reasonable, but his eyes never quite met mine, and I could see the relief in his posture as he described removing me from the main house like I was a piece of problematic furniture that needed to be stored out of sight. The garage had indeed been hastily prepared for human habitation, but the effort felt more like creating a kennel than establishing a bedroom. A twin mattress had been placed on a metal frame in one corner, with a small electric heater positioned nearby and an extension cord snaking across the concrete floor to provide power for a single lamp. A folding card table served as both desk and dining surface, with one plastic chair that looked like it had been salvaged from a patio set. The smell of motor oil and gasoline permeated everything, mixed with the musty odor of dampness that no amount of cleaning seemed able to eliminate. The bathroom situation was the most degrading aspect of my new living arrangements. There was no actual bathroom in the garage, but Marcus had installed a small sink in one corner and provided me with a camping toilet that required regular emptying and cleaning. For showers, I was expected to use the main bathroom in the house during designated times when it wouldn't interfere with Vanessa's morning routine or Emma's bath schedule. Privacy was non-existent, with the garage door mechanism directly overhead and no insulation to muffle sounds from either inside or outside the space. That first night in the garage, I lay on the thin mattress, listening to the sounds of my former life continuing without me just a few yards away. I could hear Emma crying, Vanessa moving around the kitchen preparing dinner, Marcus watching television in the living room where I'd spent countless evenings with Robert planning our retirement dreams. The proximity made my isolation feel even more complete, like I was a ghost haunting the edges of a life that had once belonged to me. The worst part wasn't the physical discomfort, though sleeping on concrete with only a space heater for warmth was challenging for my 72-year-old bones. The worst part was the psychological impact of being literally marginalized, pushed to the very edge of the property like a piece of unwanted equipment that might still have some minimal utility if kept in working condition. Every morning when I woke up surrounded by lawnmowers and paint cans, I was reminded that my own family considered me less important than the tools they used to maintain their property. During the day, I was still expected to help with household tasks and babysitting duties, but now I had to ask permission to enter the house where I'd lived for over 40 years. Vanessa instituted a schedule for my access to common areas, explaining that pregnancy made her more sensitive to noise and disruption, and that she needed to know when people would be moving through spaces where she might be resting or nursing Emma. The schedule allowed me kitchen access for 1 hour in the morning and 1 hour in the evening, with bathroom privileges available during specific windows that wouldn't conflict with family routines. The humiliation of following this schedule was compounded by the way Vanessa would monitor my compliance, making notes about whether I'd stayed within my allotted time limits, and commenting on any infractions with the patience of someone training an unruly pet. When I pointed out that I wasn't technically a guest in need of bathroom scheduling, she'd remind me that we all needed to make compromises to ensure the household ran smoothly, and that my cooperation was essential for maintaining the harmony that would be best for Emma's development. My meals became another source of degradation, as I was no longer invited to join family dinners but was instead provided with plates of leftovers that I could take back to the garage to eat alone. Vanessa explained that Emma was going through a difficult phase that required consistent routines and minimal stimulation during mealtimes, making it necessary to limit the number of people at the dinner table. The portions were adequate but not generous, and I often found myself hungry by bedtime with no easy access to additional food without violating the kitchen schedule. The social isolation was perhaps more damaging than the physical discomfort. My bridge group had been meeting for over 15 years, but the garage's location made it impossible to host our weekly games as I'd done for the past decade. When I suggested that we could meet in the main house while Marcus and Vanessa were out, Vanessa explained that she wasn't comfortable having strangers in her home without her present, and that the liability issues made such arrangements too risky to consider. My church attendance became sporadic because I was no longer allowed to use the main phone to arrange rides with friends, and my own cell phone had poor reception in the garage. When I missed several Sundays in a row, Pastor Williams called to check on me, but Vanessa intercepted the call and explained that I'd been having some health issues that required rest and limited social contact. She assured him that I was being well cared for and would return to regular attendance when I felt stronger. The lies that Vanessa told on my behalf were particularly disturbing because they created a narrative about my declining health and mental capacity that justified increasingly restrictive treatment. She began telling neighbors and family friends that I was experiencing early signs of dementia, pointing to incidents of forgetfulness or confusion that were actually the result of my disrupted sleep and emotional distress. When people expressed concern or offered to help, she'd thank them graciously and explain that Marcus and she were handling everything with the guidance of my doctors. These fabricated medical concerns also provided justification for monitoring my activities and communications more closely. Vanessa convinced Marcus that I might become disoriented or confused if left alone for extended periods, leading to safety protocols that required me to check in at regular intervals and report any plans to leave the property. When I protested that I was perfectly capable of managing my own daily activities, Marcus would point to recent incidents of forgetfulness as evidence that some supervision was necessary for my own protection. The incidents he referenced were real, but they were the predictable result of stress, poor sleep, and the emotional trauma of losing my home and independence rather than signs of cognitive decline. I'd forgotten to turn off the space heater one morning, left a faucet running for several minutes, and misplaced my keys twice in 1 week. These lapses were concerning to me as well, but I understood them as symptoms of my current living situation rather than evidence of permanent mental deterioration. The financial aspects of my situation became increasingly precarious as well, though the details were kept deliberately vague to prevent me from understanding exactly how my money was being managed. Marcus had gained access to my accounts when I'd given him power of attorney as part of the house transfer, explaining that it would be easier for him to handle bill payments and major expenses without requiring my signature for every transaction. At the time, the arrangement had seemed convenient and sensible, but now I realized how completely it had removed my ability to make independent financial decisions. My Social Security payments continued to be deposited into accounts that Marcus controlled, with no clear accounting of how much money was being allocated for my personal expenses versus household contributions. When I asked for specific information about my financial situation, Marcus would provide vague reassurances that everything was being handled properly and that I didn't need to worry about complicated financial details that would only cause me stress. The lack of financial transparency made it impossible for me to evaluate options for alternative living arrangements, or to understand whether I had resources available to hire legal representation if I decided to challenge my current situation. Marcus assured me that he was setting aside money for my future care needs, but without access to actual account statements or records, I had no way to verify these claims or plan for my own future. The medical care I received also became subject to Marcus and Vanessa's control and interpretation. They accompanied me to doctor's appointments, explaining that I sometimes became confused about medications or failed to accurately report symptoms, making their presence necessary for effective communication with healthcare providers. During these appointments, they would describe incidents of forgetfulness or disorientation that painted a picture of progressive decline, while I sat silently feeling like a specimen being discussed rather than a patient with my own voice and perspective. When I tried to speak privately with my longtime physician, Dr. Rodriguez, about my living situation and emotional state, Vanessa would interrupt to provide what she called essential context about my daily functioning and mental status. She described my resistance to necessary changes as evidence of poor judgment, my complaints about living conditions as examples of confusion about reality, and my desire for independence as unrealistic expectations given my declining capabilities. Dr. Rodriguez had known me for over 20 years, but the combination of my obvious distress and Vanessa's confident presentation of symptoms created enough doubt about my mental state that he began recommending medications for anxiety and depression, rather than investigating whether my emotional state might be a reasonable response to my circumstances. The medications made me feel drowsy and disconnected, which in turn provided additional evidence for Marcus and Vanessa's claims about my declining mental function. The spring months passed in a blur of increasing restrictions and diminishing autonomy, with each day bringing new limitations disguised as helpful accommodations for my changing needs. I was no longer allowed to drive, supposedly for safety reasons after Vanessa reported that she'd observed signs of confusion and poor judgment behind the wheel. My car keys were confiscated for my own protection, with promises that transportation would be provided for essential errands and medical appointments. Shopping for personal items became another area of control, as Vanessa took over purchasing decisions for everything from clothing to toiletries, explaining that I'd been making poor choices and wasting money on unnecessary items. She'd bring me selections of appropriate options, usually the cheapest available alternatives, and present them as generous gifts rather than basic necessities that any adult should be able to choose for themselves. The books and personal belongings that I'd moved to the garage gradually disappeared, relocated to storage areas throughout the house where they wouldn't clutter my small living space or create fire hazards around the electrical equipment. Each time I noticed something missing, Vanessa would explain that she'd moved it to a safer location where it wouldn't be damaged by the moisture and temperature fluctuations in the garage. But when I asked to retrieve specific items, there always seemed to be reasons why they weren't immediately accessible. By June, I felt like I was disappearing entirely, not just from the house but from my own life. The woman who had raised 3 children, taught elementary school for 3 decades, and managed a household through decades of challenges and changes, had been replaced by a confused, dependent person who required constant supervision and guidance. The transformation felt like a deliberate assassination of my identity, carried out with such systematic thoroughness that I sometimes wondered if I really was losing my mind. It was during one of my lowest moments, sitting on the concrete floor of the garage trying to remember what day it was, that I heard Vanessa talking to her sister again through the thin wall that separated my space from the house. This time, she wasn't just complaining about having to deal with me or joking about old people who didn't know when to leave. This time, she was describing her plans for the next phase of my elimination from their lives. The baby was due in just 6 weeks, she explained, and they'd found a long-term care facility that specialized in dementia patients and would be perfect for someone with my declining mental state. Marcus had been resistant to the idea at first, she admitted, but the documentation they'd gathered about my confusion and poor judgment had convinced him that professional care was necessary for my safety and well-being. They'd already begun the application process, and she expected to have me transferred within a month of the baby's birth. The facility she described sounded like a prison designed specifically for people whose families wanted them to disappear permanently. Patients weren't allowed to leave unaccompanied, phone calls were monitored, and visitors were limited to immediate family members during specified hours. The cost would consume my entire Social Security income, plus some additional funds from the proceeds of the house sale, but Vanessa seemed pleased that this arrangement would finally free them from any ongoing financial responsibility for my care. What shocked me most was hearing her describe the legal steps they'd taken to ensure that I couldn't challenge these decisions or reclaim control over my own life. Marcus had used his power of attorney to establish a trust that would manage my assets, with himself as the trustee responsible for making all major decisions about my care and living arrangements. My signature on the power of attorney documents had essentially transferred all my rights to someone who no longer saw me as a person deserving of respect or autonomy. As I listened to Vanessa outline this plan with the casual satisfaction of someone solving an annoying logistical problem, I felt something crystallize inside me that had been building for months. The fog of depression and medication and systematic gaslighting suddenly cleared, replaced by a cold anger that was sharper and more focused than any emotion I'd experienced since Robert's death. They thought they'd broken me completely, reduced me to a helpless dependent who would accept whatever fate they imposed without resistance. They were wrong. I was still Mildred Foster, the woman who had survived 47 years of marriage, raised 3 children, buried the love of her life, and maintained her independence through challenges that would have defeated weaker people. I might be 72 years old and sleeping in a garage, but I wasn't dead yet. And I wasn't going to disappear quietly into some institutional facility where they could forget I'd ever existed. That night, I began planning the phone call that would change everything. Not the call to Sarah that I'd been contemplating for months, though that conversation would come later. The call I needed to make first was to someone with the power to investigate what had been done to me and the authority to hold Marcus and Vanessa accountable for their actions. I needed someone who understood elder abuse and financial exploitation, someone who could see through the carefully constructed narrative about my declining mental state and recognize it as the systematic campaign of destruction that it actually was. The next morning, while Marcus was at work and Vanessa was occupied with Emma's morning routine, I walked to the small library branch that was about 6 blocks from the house. The walk was longer and more difficult than I'd expected, my muscles weakened by months of limited activity and poor nutrition, but I was determined to reach a place where I could make phone calls and do research without being monitored or interrupted. The librarian, a kind woman named Patricia who remembered me from my teaching days, was shocked by my appearance and asked if I needed help or if someone should be called. I assured her that I was fine, just doing some research, and requested access to one of the public computers where I could work privately for a few hours. She set me up in a quiet corner and brought me a cup of coffee and a small plate of cookies, treating me with the basic human kindness I'd forgotten existed. I spent the next 3 hours researching elder abuse laws, financial exploitation protections, and the legal remedies available to people who'd been coerced into transferring property or power of attorney under false pretenses. What I learned both encouraged and terrified me. There were indeed laws designed to protect people in my situation, but invoking those protections would require admitting that my own son had systematically abused and defrauded me, destroying our family relationship forever. More importantly, I discovered that the power of attorney documents I'd signed were not as absolute as Vanessa seemed to believe. There were specific procedures for challenging these arrangements when they were being used contrary to the principal's best interests, and there were agencies designed to investigate allegations of elder abuse and financial exploitation. The key was documenting the abuse and finding advocates who could help present my case to the appropriate authorities. I also researched the long-term care facility that Vanessa had mentioned to her sister, learning that it was indeed a locked memory care unit with severely restricted visitor policies and limited patient rights. Reading the descriptions of daily life in such facilities filled me with such terror that I knew I would rather die than allow myself to be imprisoned there for whatever years I had left. By the time I left the library that afternoon, I had a clear plan for the series of phone calls that would either save my life or destroy what remained of my family relationships. The first call would be to Adult Protective Services, reporting the financial exploitation and emotional abuse I'd been experiencing. The second would be to a legal aid organization that specialized in elder law, requesting assistance with challenging the power of attorney and property transfer. The third would be to Sarah, asking for her support and possibly her testimony about the changes in my living situation and mental state. The walk home was even more difficult than the morning journey, but I felt stronger and more purposeful than I had in months. For the first time since signing over the deed to my house, I felt like I had some control over my future, some possibility of reclaiming my dignity and independence before it was too late. When I arrived back at the garage, Vanessa was waiting for me with an expression of concerned disapproval that made my stomach clench with familiar dread. She'd been worried, she explained, when she discovered that I'd left the property without informing anyone of my plans or requesting permission to go out alone. What if something had happened to me? What if I'd become confused or lost? How would they have known where to look for me? I listened to her lecture about safety protocols and proper communication, nodding appropriately while inside I felt the cold satisfaction of knowing that she had no idea what I'd actually been doing during my absence. For months she'd controlled every aspect of my life through information management, keeping me isolated and dependent by limiting my access to outside resources and alternative perspectives. Now I had information that she didn't know I possessed, and I was going to use it to take back control over my own existence. That evening I lay on the thin mattress in the garage, listening to the familiar sounds of family life continuing without me, and planned exactly what I would say in each of the phone calls that would determine whether I spent my remaining years as a free woman or a prisoner. The conversations would be difficult and painful, requiring me to admit things about my family and my situation that I'd spent months trying to deny or minimize. But I was ready to tell the truth, no matter how ugly or embarrassing it might be. I was ready to fight for my right to live with dignity and autonomy, even if it meant acknowledging that the people I'd loved most had betrayed me in ways I'd never imagined possible. I was ready to make the call that would change everything, because anything was better than disappearing quietly into the institutional oblivion that Marcus and Vanessa had planned for me. The next morning, I would begin the process of reclaiming my life. I would stop being a victim and start being a survivor. And Marcus and Vanessa were about to discover that the old woman they'd dismissed as confused and helpless still had enough fight left in her to make them very, very sorry for what they'd done. The first call I made was at 7 in the morning on a Thursday, while Marcus was getting ready for work, and Vanessa was distracted with Emma's breakfast routine. I used the phone at the gas station 3 blocks away, having walked there in the pre-dawn darkness with my heart hammering so hard I thought it might wake the entire neighborhood. The number for Adult Protective Services had been written on a small piece of paper that I'd hidden inside the sole of my shoe, and my hands shook as I dialed each digit. The intake worker who answered was named Jennifer, and her voice was calm and professional as she asked me to describe my situation. I found myself stumbling over the words at first, struggling to explain how I'd gone from being a homeowner to sleeping in a garage, from being an independent widow to being treated like a confused child who couldn't be trusted with basic decisions about her own life. But Jennifer was patient, asking specific questions that helped me organize my thoughts and present the facts in a way that made the pattern of abuse clear and undeniable. She explained that what I was describing constituted both financial exploitation and emotional abuse under state elder protection laws, and that my case would be assigned to an investigator within 24 hours. Someone would need to interview me in person, she said, and they would also need to speak with Marcus and Vanessa to get their perspective on the living arrangements and care decisions that had been made. She warned me that filing a formal complaint might create additional conflict within my family, but she also emphasized that I had the right to live free from abuse regardless of my age or living situation. The second call was to the legal aid organization, where I spoke with an attorney named Michael Chen, who specialized in elder law and had extensive experience with cases involving coercive property transfers and abusive power of attorney arrangements. He listened carefully as I described the circumstances under which I'd signed over the deed to my house and granted Marcus financial authority, asking detailed questions about what promises had been made and how dramatically my actual living situation had deviated from those initial agreements. Michael explained that I had several potential legal remedies available, including the possibility of challenging the property transfer if it could be proven that it had been obtained through misrepresentation or undue influence. The power of attorney could also be revoked or modified if evidence showed that it was being used contrary to my best interests and preferences. He offered to represent me on a pro bono basis, given my financial circumstances, and scheduled an appointment for the following week to begin gathering documentation and testimony that would support my case. The third call was the most difficult one. To my daughter Sarah in Portland. I'd been dreading this conversation for months, knowing that it would force me to admit how completely I'd lost control of my life and how badly I'd misjudged Marcus's character and intentions. Sarah had always been the most emotionally perceptive of my children, and I knew she'd be devastated to learn what her brother had done to me. Sarah answered on the second ring, and the sound of her voice nearly broke my composure entirely. When I managed to explain why I was calling from a payphone instead of from home, her immediate response was a shocked silence, followed by a string of questions about when this had started and why I hadn't called her sooner. I found myself crying as I described the progression from willing house transfer to garage imprisonment, from cooperative family member to dependent ward, whose every movement was monitored and controlled. Sarah's reaction was everything I'd hoped for and feared. She was furious with Marcus, devastated that I'd been suffering alone for so long, and immediately began making plans to fly out within the next few days to see the situation for herself and help me figure out how to move forward. She also offered to provide financial support for legal fees and alternative housing if needed, assuring me that I would never have to live in an institutional facility against my will as long as she had anything to say about it. By the time I walked back to the garage that morning, I felt like a different person than the broken woman who had shuffled to that gas station in the darkness just 2 hours earlier. For the first time in months, I had allies who believed my account of what was happening and who possessed the authority and resources to help me fight back. The isolation that had been such a powerful weapon in Marcus and Vanessa's campaign of control was finally broken, replaced by a network of support that made me feel human again. The investigator from Adult Protective Services arrived that afternoon, a woman named Carol Martinez who had 20 years of experience dealing with elder abuse cases. Marcus had taken time off work to be present for the interview, clearly anticipating that he could manage the conversation and control the narrative about my care needs and living arrangements. He was not prepared for Carol's systematic questioning or her obvious skepticism about his explanations for why a formerly independent woman was now sleeping in a garage. Carol interviewed me privately first, asking me to describe my daily routine, my access to basic necessities, and my level of autonomy in making decisions about my own care and activities. She documented the sleeping arrangements in the garage, photographed the cramped living conditions, and asked detailed questions about my financial situation and medical care. When I showed her the journal I'd been keeping that documented specific incidents of humiliation and control, she spent nearly an hour reviewing the entries and asking follow-up questions about the timeline of my declining circumstances. The interview with Marcus and Vanessa was a masterclass in professional skepticism. Carol asked pointed questions about the decision-making process that had led to my relocation to the garage, the medical evaluations that had supposedly justified increased supervision, and the financial arrangements that governed my access to my own money. She requested documentation for the claims about my mental decline, copies of medical records that supported their assertions about my care needs, and detailed accounting of how my Social Security payments were being used. Marcus struggled to provide convincing answers, particularly when Carol asked why none of the supposed medical concerns about my cognitive function had been formally diagnosed or treated by qualified specialists. His explanations about temporary living arrangements and family decisions made in my best interest began to sound hollow and self-serving, when subjected to professional scrutiny by someone trained to recognize patterns of elder abuse and financial exploitation. Vanessa's performance was even less credible, particularly when Carol asked specific questions about the promises that had been made when I'd transferred ownership of the house. Vanessa's description of our living arrangement as mutually beneficial and harmonious was contradicted by the obvious evidence of my isolation and diminished status within the household. Her claims about my declining mental state were undercut by my coherent responses during the private interview and my detailed documentation of specific incidents and conversations. The most damaging moment came when Carol asked to review the financial records related to my accounts and the house transfer. Marcus was forced to admit that he couldn't immediately provide comprehensive documentation of how my money had been spent, or what assets remained available for my future care. His vague assurances about proper financial management looked increasingly suspicious when contrasted with his inability to produce basic account statements or receipts for major expenditures made on my behalf. Carol concluded the interview by informing Marcus and Vanessa that a formal investigation would be opened based on credible allegations of financial exploitation and emotional abuse. They would be required to provide detailed financial documentation within 10 days, and any attempts to relocate me or change my living situation without court approval would be considered evidence of ongoing abuse and potential obstruction of the investigation. A follow-up visit would be scheduled within the week to assess my continued safety and well-being. The atmosphere in the house after Carol left was electric with tension and barely contained rage. Marcus paced through the rooms like a caged animal, muttering about ungrateful parents and outside interference in private family matters. Vanessa's carefully maintained facade of concerned daughter-in-law cracked completely, replaced by cold fury and calculated vindictiveness that revealed the true nature of her feelings toward me. That evening, they confronted me in the garage with an ultimatum that was clearly designed to force me to withdraw my complaint and accept whatever arrangements they chose to impose. Marcus spoke first, his voice tight with controlled anger, as he accused me of betraying the family and destroying relationships that had taken years to build. He claimed that I was being manipulated by outside agitators who didn't understand our family dynamics or the genuine care and sacrifice that he and Vanessa had provided. Vanessa was less diplomatic, describing my actions as vindictive and destructive, motivated by selfishness and ingratitude rather than legitimate grievances about my treatment. She threatened to cut off all contact between me and Emma, ensuring that I would never have a relationship with my granddaughter if I continued to pursue legal action against them. She also hinted that there were aspects of my medical and mental health history that could be presented in ways that would undermine my credibility if the case proceeded to formal hearings. Their threats and emotional manipulation might have been effective 6 months earlier, when I still harbored hopes of maintaining family relationships and was willing to sacrifice my own well-being for the sake of keeping peace. But the woman they were trying to intimidate was no longer the confused and isolated victim who had accepted exile to the garage without resistance. I had allies now, people who believed my account of what had happened, and who possessed the legal authority to protect me from further abuse. I listened to their ultimatum calmly, and then informed them that I would not be withdrawing my complaint or accepting their terms for continued residence in the garage. I had consulted with an attorney who was prepared to challenge both the property transfer and the power of attorney arrangement, and I had family support for alternative living arrangements that would allow me to maintain my independence and dignity. Their threats about grandparent access and reputation damage only reinforced my conviction that they were not the kind of people I wanted influencing a child's development. The next few days brought a series of escalating confrontations, as Marcus and Vanessa realized that their usual tactics of control and intimidation were no longer effective. They attempted to restrict my access to the house phone, claiming that I was making inappropriate calls to outside agencies that violated their privacy and disrupted the household routine. When I continued to leave the property for meetings with my attorney and social services, they threatened to change the locks and exclude me entirely from the premises. These threats turned out to be empty gestures, as Carol had made it clear that any attempts to restrict my access to basic necessities or exclude me from the property would be treated as evidence of ongoing abuse and could result in immediate intervention by protective services. Marcus and Vanessa found themselves in the uncomfortable position of being monitored and scrutinized by outside authorities, their every action subject to interpretation as either compliance with elder protection requirements or further evidence of abusive behavior. The financial investigation proved particularly damaging to their position, as Michael Chen's systematic review of bank records and expenditures revealed a pattern of misappropriation that went far beyond what I had suspected. Not only had they been using my Social Security payments to subsidize their household expenses without my knowledge or consent, but they had also taken significant amounts from the savings account that Robert and I had accumulated over decades of careful budgeting and sacrifice. The most egregious discovery was that Marcus had used his power of attorney to take out a home equity loan against the house that now legally belonged to him, using my former property as collateral for personal debts and investments that had nothing to do with my care or well-being. The loan payments were being made from my own accounts, meaning that I was essentially paying to have my former home used as collateral for someone else's financial ventures. Michael explained that this constituted clear evidence of financial exploitation under state law, as the power of attorney authority was supposed to be used solely for my benefit rather than to facilitate Marcus's personal financial goals. The pattern of deception and self-dealing provided strong grounds for both criminal charges and civil recovery of the misappropriated funds, potentially including the return of the house itself, if the transfer could be proven to have been obtained through fraud. Sarah arrived from Portland on a Tuesday morning, and seeing her walk up the driveway toward the garage where I was living was one of the most emotional moments of the entire ordeal. She took one look at my sleeping arrangements and living conditions and began crying, apologizing over and over for not staying in closer contact and for not recognizing how serious my situation had become. Her presence provided both emotional support and practical assistance, as she immediately began documenting the conditions in the garage and gathering additional evidence that could be used in legal proceedings. Sarah's conversation with Marcus was brief and devastating, as she made it clear that she held him personally responsible for my deteriorated circumstances and would support whatever legal action was necessary to ensure my safety and dignity. She offered to provide temporary housing for me at her home in Portland while legal proceedings were resolved, giving me an immediate alternative to both the garage and the institutional facility that Marcus and Vanessa had planned for my future. The turning point came during a meeting with all parties present, including Carol from Adult Protective Services, Michael Chen, and a representative from the district attorney's office, who was evaluating whether criminal charges should be filed for financial exploitation of an elderly person. Marcus and Vanessa had hired their own attorney, but their legal position was severely undermined by the financial evidence and the documented pattern of isolation and control that had characterized their treatment of me. Michael presented a comprehensive timeline of the property transfer, the power of attorney arrangement, and the subsequent deterioration of my living conditions and autonomy. He demonstrated that the promises made to secure my cooperation with the house transfer had been systematically violated, and that the power of attorney had been used primarily to benefit Marcus rather than to protect my interests and well-being. The evidence of financial exploitation was so clear and extensive that their attorney advised them to consider a settlement rather than risk criminal prosecution and civil liability. The settlement negotiations took place over several days, with Michael and Sarah advocating for terms that would restore my independence and dignity while providing compensation for the financial losses I had sustained. The final agreement required Marcus to return ownership of the house to me, with the understanding that I would then have the right to sell it and use the proceeds to establish independent housing that met my needs and preferences. The home equity loan that Marcus had taken out against the property would become his sole responsibility, to be paid from his own resources without any claim on my assets or income. All of my personal property that had been relocated or disposed of without my consent would be returned or replaced at their expense. Most importantly, the power of attorney arrangement would be formally revoked, returning full control over my financial and medical decisions to me personally. Marcus was also required to provide a complete accounting of all expenditures made from my accounts during the period when he had financial control, with restitution for any amounts that had been used for purposes other than my direct care and support. The total amount of restitution was substantial, reflecting not only the misappropriated Social Security payments, but also the savings that had been depleted to subsidize their household expenses and personal investments. The emotional impact of these revelations on family relationships was profound and probably irreparable. Marcus seemed genuinely shocked by the legal characterization of his actions as elder abuse and financial exploitation, claiming that he had believed he was acting in my best interests and had never intended to cause harm or distress. But his protests were undermined by the evidence of deliberate deception and the systematic nature of the control and isolation that had been imposed on me. Vanessa showed no similar signs of remorse or surprise, instead maintaining that their actions had been justified by my declining mental state and need for increased supervision. Her continued insistence that I was confused and unreliable, even in the face of clear evidence to the contrary, suggested that she either genuinely believed her own fabrications or was so committed to her narrative that she couldn't acknowledge reality when it contradicted her preferred version of events. The prospect of criminal charges provided additional motivation for compliance with the settlement terms, as the district attorney had made it clear that prosecution remained an option if there was any evidence of continued financial exploitation or attempts to interfere with my recovery of assets and autonomy. Marcus and Vanessa understood that their cooperation with the settlement was being closely monitored, and that any violations could result in immediate criminal consequences. The day I moved out of the garage and back into my own house was both triumphant and bittersweet, as I reclaimed spaces that had been systematically stripped of my presence and personality over the previous 2 years. Sarah helped me carry my few remaining possessions from the concrete floor, where I'd been sleeping, back to the master bedroom, where Robert and I had shared so many years of marriage and partnership. The physical act of crossing that threshold felt like resurrection, a return to life after a period of social and emotional death. But the house itself felt different, marked by the trauma of what had happened there, and filled with reminders of how completely I had been betrayed by people I had trusted unconditionally. The rooms where Marcus and Vanessa had systematically erased my presence and history would need to be reclaimed gradually, filled again with objects and memories that reflected my own identity, rather than serving as monuments to their temporary occupation. The legal proceedings had restored my property and financial independence, but they could not repair the damage to family relationships, or erase the knowledge of how easily love could be corrupted into control and care could be twisted into exploitation. Marcus and Vanessa moved out within the week, taking Emma with them to a rental apartment across town, and the silence they left behind was both peaceful and heartbreaking. Sarah stayed for 2 more weeks, helping me sort through the belongings that had been returned and begin the process of making the house feel like home again. We spent hours talking about what had happened and why, trying to understand how a son who had been raised with love and respect could have treated his mother with such calculated cruelty. Sarah blamed herself for not staying in closer contact, for not recognizing the warning signs, for not being available when I needed support and advocacy most. I found myself less interested in assigning blame than in understanding how to move forward with dignity and purpose. The experience had taught me valuable lessons about the importance of maintaining independence and social connections, about the necessity of having multiple people involved in major life decisions, and about the warning signs that should prompt immediate action when relationships begin to shift toward control and exploitation. The financial restitution and returned property ownership gave me options for my future that I had thought were lost forever. I could remain in the house with modifications that would make it more manageable for an aging woman living alone. Or I could sell it and use the proceeds to establish a more suitable living situation that would provide security and social connection without requiring dependence on family members who might not have my best interests at heart. The decision I ultimately made was to sell the house and use the proceeds to purchase a smaller home in a community designed for active seniors, where I could maintain my independence while having access to social activities and support services that would reduce the risk of future isolation and vulnerability. The house where Robert and I had built our life together was too large for my current needs and too filled with painful memories of recent betrayals to serve as a comfortable refuge for my remaining years. Before listing the property, I spent several days in each room, gathering specific items that held genuine sentimental value, and boxing up belongings that I wanted to keep as connections to my life with Robert and the early years of raising my children. The rose garden that had been destroyed to make room for playground equipment was beyond recovery, but I was able to take cuttings from a few surviving plants that could be cultivated in containers at my new home. The sale process moved quickly, as the house was in a desirable neighborhood and had been well maintained despite the upheaval of the previous 2 years. The proceeds, combined with the restitution from Marcus and my accumulated Social Security benefits, provided sufficient resources for me to purchase a comfortable home and establish a financial cushion that would support my independence for the foreseeable future. My new home was a small ranch-style house in a community where most residents were over 60, and many had chosen the location specifically to maintain independence while having access to social activities and mutual support networks. The neighbors were friendly without being intrusive, and the community center offered classes, clubs, and volunteer opportunities that would help me rebuild the social connections that had been so systematically destroyed during my time in the garage. The legal proceedings had been concluded, but the personal reckoning was more complex and ongoing. Marcus made several attempts to reconcile, sending letters that expressed regret for how things had turned out, while stopping short of accepting full responsibility for the abuse and exploitation that had occurred. His communications suggested that he still viewed the situation as a misunderstanding, rather than a deliberate campaign of financial and emotional abuse. I responded to his overtures with polite but firm boundaries, making it clear that any future relationship would require genuine acknowledgement of the harm that had been done, and consistent demonstration of respect for my autonomy and dignity. I was not interested in pretending that the past 2 years had been anything other than a systematic betrayal of trust, and I would not accept responsibility for repairing relationships that had been damaged by his own choices and actions. Vanessa made no attempt at reconciliation, which was actually a relief given her role as the primary architect of many of the most humiliating aspects of my treatment. Her absence from any settlement discussions or family communications suggested that she remained convinced of the righteousness of her position and felt no obligation to acknowledge the pain and damage she had caused. The most heartbreaking aspect of the entire situation was the impact on my relationship with Emma, who had been too young during most of the abuse to understand what was happening but who was now being raised by parents whose character and judgment I could no longer trust. The settlement agreement included provisions for grandparent visitation rights, but the practical reality was that any contact with Emma would necessarily involve interaction with Marcus and Vanessa in ways that felt forced and artificial. I decided to focus my energy on building a new life rather than fighting for access to family relationships that had been poisoned by the events of the previous 2 years. Sarah and I grew closer through the shared experience of confronting the abuse and working together toward legal resolution, and I began developing friendships with other women in my new community who had faced similar challenges in maintaining independence and dignity as they aged. 6 months after moving into my new home, I started volunteering with a local organization that provided advocacy and support services for elderly people facing financial exploitation and family abuse. My experience gave me credibility and insight that proved valuable in helping other women recognize warning signs and understand their legal options for protection and recovery. The work was emotionally challenging, as it required me to revisit my own trauma while helping others navigate similar situations, but it also provided a sense of purpose and meaning that helped transform my personal suffering into something that could benefit others facing comparable challenges. I found that sharing my story in appropriate contexts helped other women understand that they were not alone, and that recovery was possible even in situations that seemed hopeless. A year after the settlement, I received word through Sarah that Marcus and Vanessa had divorced, their marriage apparently unable to survive the stress of legal proceedings and the loss of the financial security they had expected to gain through their control of my assets. Marcus had been forced to declare bankruptcy as a result of the home equity loan obligations and legal fees, while Vanessa had moved back to her parents' home with Emma. The news brought me no satisfaction, as I had never wished for their personal destruction despite the pain they had caused me. But it did provide a sense of closure, confirming that their partnership had been based primarily on shared financial goals rather than genuine love and mutual respect. The dissolution of their marriage felt like the final consequence of choices they had made when they decided to treat me as a resource to be exploited rather than a person to be cherished. My own life continued to improve steadily, with new friendships, meaningful volunteer work, and the deep satisfaction of having reclaimed my independence and dignity through my own courage and determination. The house where I now lived was smaller than the family home where Robert and I had raised our children, but it was mine in ways that felt more secure and permanent than any property ownership I had experienced before. The financial security provided by the settlement and house sale meant that I could make choices about my future based on my own preferences and values, rather than being dependent on family members whose motivations might be compromised by self-interest. I had learned to be suspicious of arrangements that required me to give up control in exchange for promises of care and security, understanding that true security came from maintaining multiple options and relationships, rather than putting all trust in any single person or institution. The experience had aged me in some ways, taking away the innocent trust I had once placed in family loyalty and unconditional love. But it had also strengthened me, proving that I possessed reserves of courage and resilience that I had not fully appreciated during the easier decades of my marriage and motherhood. I was no longer the same woman who had signed over her house deed in a lawyer's office 2 years earlier, and the changes went far deeper than the legal restoration of property and financial control. I was now a woman who understood the difference between love and manipulation, between care and control, between family loyalty and personal dignity. I had learned to recognize warning signs that I had missed before, to maintain social connections that could provide alternative perspectives on my situation, and to seek professional help when family relationships became characterized by exploitation, rather than mutual respect and support. Most importantly, I had learned that it was never too late to fight back, never too late to reclaim control over my own life, and never too late to find new sources of meaning and connection, even after experiencing profound betrayal and loss. The phone call I had made from that gas station in the early morning darkness had indeed changed everything, not just for me but for everyone involved in the situation. My story became a reminder that elder abuse could happen in families that appeared loving and functional from the outside, that financial exploitation often began with seemingly reasonable requests for help with property management, and that recovery was possible even in situations where the victim felt completely powerless and isolated. Through speaking about my experience at community events and support groups, I hope to help other older women recognize that they deserve to live with dignity and autonomy, regardless of their age or family circumstances. The garage where I had spent those humiliating months was now just a memory, but it had taught me that the difference between being housed and being home was the difference between being warehoused and being valued, between existing and truly living. I would never again confuse the two, and I would never again allow anyone to convince me that accepting less than full respect and autonomy was the price I had to pay for family relationships or financial security. The seasons changed in my new community, with a rhythm that felt both familiar and refreshingly different from the calculated chaos that had defined my final years in the family home. My small ranch house sat on a quiet street lined with mature oak trees that reminded me of the neighborhood where Robert and I had raised our children, but without the painful associations that had made every corner of that previous life feel haunted by betrayal and loss. Here, the falling leaves in autumn and the first green shoots of spring belonged to my own timeline again, marking passages of time that I controlled rather than endured. My daily routine evolved gradually into something that surprised me with its richness and variety. Morning coffee was no longer a hurried affair squeezed into scheduled access times, but a leisurely ritual that I could extend for as long as I wished, while reading the newspaper or watching birds gather at the feeder I'd installed outside my kitchen window. The simple pleasure of being able to make decisions about how to spend my time, what to eat for breakfast, or when to shower, had been so thoroughly stripped away during my months in the garage that reclaiming these basic elements of autonomy felt like discovering luxuries I'd never fully appreciated before. The volunteer work with the Elder Advocacy Organization became increasingly central to my sense of purpose and identity. What had begun as a way to process my own trauma through helping others had evolved into something approaching a second career, one that utilized skills and insights I'd never known I possessed. The training sessions taught me to recognize patterns of financial exploitation that went far beyond my own experience, revealing the sophisticated ways that unscrupulous family members and caregivers could gradually assume control over an older person's life while maintaining the appearance of providing care and support. Each woman I worked with brought her own variation on themes that had become painfully familiar to me. There was Margaret, whose son had convinced her to add his name to her bank accounts for convenience, then systematically drained her savings to fund his gambling addiction while she struggled to pay for prescription medications. There was Dorothy, whose daughter-in-law had moved into her home ostensibly to provide care after a minor stroke, then gradually taken over every aspect of household management, while treating Dorothy like an unwelcome boarder in her own space. These stories validated my own experience, while also making me understand how common such abuse had become, as families faced increasing financial pressures, and older adults lived longer with assets that represented tempting targets for adult children struggling with their own economic challenges. The patterns were remarkably consistent across different families and circumstances, suggesting that the tactics Marcus and Vanessa had used were part of a broader social phenomenon, rather than unique acts of individual cruelty. Learning to tell my own story in public settings required overcoming decades of socialization that had taught me to keep family problems private and avoid airing personal grievances in front of strangers. The first time I spoke at a community education event about elder abuse, my voice shook so badly that I could barely get through the prepared remarks about warning signs and available resources. But the response from audience members was immediate and powerful, with several women approaching me afterward to share their own experiences of financial exploitation and emotional manipulation by family members they had trusted completely. These conversations taught me that shame was one of the most powerful weapons used against elder abuse victims, keeping us isolated and silent while our situations deteriorated beyond the point of easy recovery. Many of the women I met had suffered in silence for years, convinced that admitting their families were treating them poorly would reflect badly on their parenting or their judgment, or that seeking outside help would be seen as betraying family loyalty and privacy. My own willingness to speak openly about what Marcus and Vanessa had done to me, and how I had fought back to reclaim my independence, seemed to give other women permission to acknowledge their own situations and consider options for change that they had dismissed as impossible or inappropriate. The power of shared experience to break through isolation and shame was something I had never fully understood until I began witnessing its effects in support group meetings and educational workshops. The advocacy work also connected me with attorneys, social workers, and law enforcement officers who specialized in elder abuse cases, giving me a broader understanding of the legal and social service systems that existed to protect older adults, but were often underutilized because victims were reluctant to seek help or didn't know such resources were available. The complexity of these systems was daunting, requiring navigation through multiple agencies and bureaucracies that could be intimidating for people who were already feeling overwhelmed and powerless. Working within these systems as an advocate rather than a victim gave me insights into how they could be improved and made more accessible to people facing similar situations to what I had experienced. I began participating in policy discussions about strengthening elder protection laws, improving coordination between agencies, and developing better training for professionals who might encounter signs of financial exploitation or family abuse in their work with older clients. The financial security I had achieved through the legal settlement and property sale allowed me to be selective about how I spent my time and energy, choosing volunteer commitments based on their potential impact rather than financial necessity. This freedom was something I had never experienced before, having moved directly from my parents' home to marriage with Robert, then from widowhood to dependence on Marcus and Vanessa, without ever having a period of complete personal autonomy and financial independence. Learning to manage my own money again after years of having financial decisions made for me was both liberating and occasionally overwhelming. I found myself second-guessing purchases that I could easily afford, then reminding myself that I had earned the right to buy quality groceries or replace worn-out furniture without seeking anyone's permission or approval. The psychological impact of financial abuse extended far beyond the actual monetary losses, creating patterns of self-doubt and restriction that required conscious effort to overcome. Working with a financial advisor who specialized in serving older women helped me develop investment and spending strategies that balanced security with the recognition that I deserved to enjoy the fruits of a lifetime of work and sacrifice. She helped me understand that being financially conservative was appropriate given my age and circumstances, but that excessive frugality could be its own form of self-punishment that prevented me from living fully during my remaining years. The social connections I developed in my new community were different in quality from the relationships I had maintained during my married years, when most of my social identity had been tied to Robert's career and our children's activities. Here I was known simply as Millie Foster, the woman who lived in the blue house on Elm Street and volunteered with the Elder Advocacy Program, rather than as Robert's widow or Marcus's problematic mother who needed management and supervision. My next-door neighbor Helen became a particularly close friend through shared morning walks and weekly trips to the farmer's market. She had moved to the community after her own divorce at age 68. Having discovered that her husband of 45 years had been systematically hiding assets and maintaining secret accounts that left her far less financially secure than she had believed. Her experience of late-life betrayal by a trusted spouse had similarities to my own family situation, creating a foundation for understanding and mutual support that felt both comfortable and healing. Helen's journey toward independence had been different from mine, but her insights about rebuilding identity and purpose after fundamental trust had been shattered were invaluable in helping me process my own experience and move forward without becoming defined by the trauma I had survived. She had a practical wisdom about the importance of maintaining multiple friendships and interests rather than depending too heavily on any single relationship for emotional or social fulfillment. Together, we developed routines and traditions that belonged entirely to our new phase of life, rather than being attempts to recreate or replace what we had lost. Weekly bridge games with two other women from the community became a highlight that I looked forward to with genuine enthusiasm, not because it reminded me of my previous bridge group, but because it represented something entirely my own, chosen and maintained according to my current preferences and schedule. The seasonal rhythms of community life provided structure and anticipation that replaced the holiday traditions that had been corrupted by memories of how Marcus and Vanessa had systematically excluded me from celebrations in my own former home. Halloween brought trick-or-treaters who delighted in the elaborate decorations I put up without having to worry about whether they met someone else's standards for appropriateness or safety. Christmas became an opportunity to host a potluck dinner for neighbors who had become chosen family, creating new traditions that reflected my current values and relationships rather than trying to maintain customs that had been poisoned by recent painful associations. The ongoing legal aftermath of my case occasionally intruded on this new life, with reminders that consequences from the abuse were still playing out in ways beyond my direct control. Marcus's bankruptcy proceedings had been complicated by questions about which assets had been legitimately acquired versus obtained through exploitation of my finances, leading to prolonged court processes that sometimes required my testimony or documentation. These legal obligations were manageable but emotionally draining, forcing me to revisit details of the abuse and maintain contact with attorneys and court personnel, who treated my experience as a case file, rather than a personal trauma that had fundamentally altered my understanding of family and trust. The efficient resolution of financial matters could not address the deeper psychological damage that had been done, and I found that legal victory did not automatically translate into emotional healing. Therapy became an important component of my recovery process, though I was initially resistant to the idea of discussing my private family business with a stranger who might judge my decisions or question my handling of the situation. The therapist I eventually found specialized in working with older adults who had experienced family abuse, and her understanding of the particular dynamics involved in elder exploitation helped me process feelings of guilt, shame, and grief that persisted long after the practical problems had been resolved. Working through these emotions in a safe, confidential setting allowed me to separate my role as a victim of abuse from my identity as a person who had successfully fought back and reclaimed her independence. The therapy helped me understand that my initial trust in Marcus and Vanessa's promises had been reasonable, given the information I had at the time, and that their decision to exploit that trust said nothing about my worth or judgment, but everything about their character and values. Understanding the psychology behind financial exploitation and family abuse also helped me become more effective in my advocacy work, as I developed better skills for helping other victims recognize that their situations were not their fault, and that seeking help was a sign of strength rather than failure. Many of the women I worked with struggled with similar feelings of self-blame and embarrassment, convinced they should have been able to prevent or stop the abuse through better judgment or stronger resistance. The support groups I facilitated became laboratories for working through these complex emotions, while also providing practical information about legal options and protective resources. Watching other women progress from shame and isolation toward empowerment and action reminded me regularly of how far I had come in my own recovery, while also keeping me grounded in the ongoing reality that elder abuse remained a widespread problem requiring continued advocacy and public education efforts. Speaking engagements at community centers, churches, and senior living facilities became increasingly comfortable and effective, as I developed confidence in my ability to present information in ways that were both educational and empowering. The questions I received from audience members helped me refine my understanding of the barriers that prevented people from recognizing abuse or seeking help, leading to more targeted and practical advice about warning signs and intervention strategies. One particularly meaningful speaking opportunity came when I was invited to address a group of social work students at the local university about the victim's perspective on elder abuse investigations and interventions. The students were eager to understand how their future professional responses could be more effective and less re-traumatizing for clients who had already been damaged by exploitation and betrayal within their own families. Their questions challenged me to think more systematically about what had been most helpful versus most frustrating about my interactions with various professionals during my case, leading to insights that I hadn't fully processed before. The investigation process had been necessary and ultimately successful, but it had also been intrusive and emotionally difficult in ways that could potentially be minimized through better training and more sensitive approaches to gathering evidence and testimony. My recommendations to the students focused on the importance of believing victims' accounts even when family members presented alternative explanations, understanding that documentation and proof gathering should not delay immediate safety interventions, and recognizing that legal resolution of financial matters was only one component of recovery that needed to be accompanied by emotional support and practical assistance with rebuilding independence and social connections. The academic interest in my case led to an invitation to participate in a research study about factors that enabled successful recovery from elder financial exploitation. The researchers were particularly interested in understanding why some victims were able to take action to protect themselves, while others remained trapped in abusive situations for years or until death made intervention irrelevant. Participating in the research required detailed interviews about my background, personality characteristics, and social resources that had contributed to my ability to recognize the abuse and seek help. The process was sometimes uncomfortable, as it required analyzing personal qualities and circumstances that felt private and potentially judgmental. But I was motivated by the hope that better understanding of successful intervention could help develop more effective strategies for helping other victims. The preliminary findings suggested that several factors had been crucial in my case, including my previous professional experience as a teacher that had given me confidence in dealing with authority figures and bureaucratic systems, my maintained relationship with Sarah that provided alternative perspective and practical support, and my access to financial resources that made independent living viable once I had reclaimed control of my assets. These insights were both encouraging and sobering, as they suggested that victims without similar advantages might face much greater barriers to escaping exploitive situations. The research reinforced my commitment to advocacy work, while also highlighting the need for systemic changes that would make help more accessible to people who lacked the specific combination of resources and circumstances that had enabled my recovery. The seasonal cycle of my second year in the new community brought deeper satisfaction and comfort, as routines became habits and acquaintances developed into genuine friendships. The anxiety that had characterized my first months of independent living gradually gave way to confidence in my ability to manage both daily challenges and unexpected problems, without depending on family members whose motivations might be compromised by self-interest. Small emergencies like a furnace malfunction or a minor car accident became opportunities to practice the independence and problem-solving skills that I had been systematically prevented from using during my time under Marcus and Vanessa's control. Each successful resolution of a practical problem reinforced my sense of competence and autonomy, building evidence that contradicted their claims about my declining capabilities and need for supervision. The rose garden I had started in containers on my patio had flourished beyond my expectations, producing blooms that carried forward Robert's legacy in a form that belonged entirely to my new life, rather than being haunted by memories of destruction and replacement. The daily care required by the roses provided meditative time for reflection and planning, while their seasonal cycles marked passages of time that felt hopeful, rather than merely endured. Looking ahead to the future, I found myself making plans that extended years into the future, rather than simply surviving from one day to the next, as I had during the worst periods of abuse and immediately afterward. The financial security provided by the legal settlement gave me confidence that I could maintain my independence for the foreseeable future, while the social connections and meaningful work I had developed provided reasons to anticipate continued growth and contribution, rather than mere existence. The woman who had signed over her house deed in that lawyer's office seemed like a different person now, someone whose trust and optimism had been systematically exploited, but whose core strength and intelligence had ultimately enabled her to fight back and reclaim control over her own life. The journey from that moment of vulnerability to my current state of empowered independence had been painful and difficult, but it had also revealed capabilities and resilience that I had never been required to test during the easier decades of my marriage and early widowhood. Most importantly, I had learned that it was never too late to start over, never too late to recognize abuse and seek help, and never too late to build new relationships and find new sources of meaning and purpose. The phone call that had changed everything had been just the beginning of a transformation that continued to unfold, as I discovered what was possible when I stopped accepting other people's definitions of my limitations and started making my own choices about how to live the remaining chapters of my life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.